Neama Rahmani, former federal prosecutor, as well as Gilbert Paris, criminal defense attorney. Neama, I'll start with you. I mean, the jury here has to make a moral decision here, whether Stephen Wiggins should get death or life in prison after hearing so much testimony in this penalty phase about his mental troubles, his mental impairment, having a hole in his head. Should that excuse him from the death penalty?
Derek, this case, from the defense perspective, was all about avoiding the death penalty. I think if life was on the table, we wouldn't even have gone to trial. Even at trial, the defense argued that it wasn't premeditated. They admitted that Wiggins killed Baker. So really, we're at the point that we expected. But this was a particularly heinous crime, as you mentioned. Just hearing Lisa Baker, the widow's testimony, talking about Sergeant Baker's 2-year-old daughter, how she still calls him every night on their play phone, asking if he's going to come back. If you believe in the death penalty, this is a death penalty case. You have an execution, I wouldn't even call it a murder, of a police officer shot 6 times. Just really, really sad and horrific facts in this case. So, does Wiggins' past history of abuse, does that excuse him? I don't think so personally, but it's ultimately going to be up to this jury to decide whether he deserves death. And given how quickly they deliberated during the guilt phase, returning that guilty verdict in about an hour, I expect them to return a death penalty verdict in this case.
Neama, hearing that from the defense attorney saying, this is not an excuse, there is no forgiveness here, but really take a look at his mental health issues that have gone all the way back to his childhood. He's making a strong argument there that Stephen Wiggins should not get death.
Derek, I agree. And, defense attorneys, you have to play with the hand that you're dealt. And they did not overplay their hand. They didn't ask for him to get off. They didn't ask for any type of lesser sentence than life. So I really like how they handled the case from an attorney perspective, because they didn't ask the jury for something that at least would be considered unreasonable. They're asking for life in prison without parole. And I thought both the defense argument as well as Wiggins' mom, who testified yesterday, I thought that was very effective. And if this jury comes back with a verdict of less than death, of life in prison, then ultimately it'll be the defense strategy and Wiggins' mom who deserve the credit for that.
Tattoos were very specific, and again, the argument's made that Wiggins is bragging with the ink on his body.
I agree with Gilbert. This is an absolute nightmare for the defense team. You have someone that has shown no remorse, no acceptance of responsibility, no compassion for this victim and his family, and has gone even further to brag about being on death row and showing no mercy for his victim. And that was consistent with some of the statements he made to law enforcement after he was arrested. So this is not good for the defense, and certainly something that the defense does not want to put in front of this jury, because it completely undermines their argument of someone that deserves to be spared death in this case.
Right. Well, defense attorneys, notwithstanding the tattoos, have argued that Stephen Wiggins has had no issues while behind bars. Is it impulsive? Is it poor judgment? And that's just it?
It's certainly very poor judgment when you're looking at a potential death sentence. Again, I feel for defense attorneys sometimes, because they really want to control their client, control the narrative, and the client goes in a completely different direction and sabotages their own case. I mean, I've heard defense attorneys say, "Help me, help you." And Wiggins did not help himself with these tattoos. So I understand the argument, but it's certainly a very challenging one. And another one of the reasons why they just have a very, very poor case here from a defense perspective.
Neama Rahmani, hard to overcome that in the minds of the jury as well.
Very hard to overcome. And again, if Wiggins gets death, it's because of Lisa Baker and because of her testimony, and because this was so heinous. I mean, I just, and we've covered a lot of these cases together on Law and Crime, just really brutal, horrific murders. But this was one of the worst that I've seen, again, because it left a woman, a widow, and a young daughter, an orphan, and incredibly, incredibly sad. So very fast deliberations, as we expected during the guilt phase. It really is going to turn on whether these 12 jurors, believe in the death penalty. I know there was extensive voir dire about the death penalty, but if you believe in the death penalty, Derek, this is a death penalty case. If you don't, for public policy or moral reasons, that's another question altogether. But if you believe in the death penalty, Wiggins deserves death.
It certainly is a moral question. The abuse factor here is definitely a mitigating circumstance, at least on the minds of the defense. I'm not sure how jurors would take it.
Very sad. I mean, there's no question that Stephen and his brother suffered this horrible abuse. I mean, these beatings, being locked in their own home. Their father was a monster, and Stephen may not have even had a chance. That being said, I think at least from the jurors' perspective, a lot of them will say that's certainly not a license to kill. Potential mitigation, and really the only good argument that the defense has, if Stephen Wiggins is spared the death penalty, he has his mother to thank, because that is the only reason and really the only sympathetic witness that this jury heard from the defense.
The sad fact is, and it is sad, that there are a lot of children that are abused in this country and around the world, and they don't all kill, and certainly not in this manner, right, Neama Rahmani?
No, they don't. And I agree with you, Derek, that, Scott Wiggins is a monster. And with Gilbert, I mean, this was just very powerful testimony. And, for someone who certainly isn't probably accustomed to testifying in court and talking to jurors, she did a very good job connecting with them, really describing these horrific offenses. Imagine just running away in the woods, running from your father who's shooting at you, trying to kill you. And this is just one of many traumatic events that Stephen suffered from. So, very good testimony for the defense. By far and away, the best witness, as we've discussed. I certainly agree that it's not an excuse. There are many, many children in this country who are physically and sexually abused, unfortunately. But the facts are that there is a very high correlation with children who see violence in the home like this and becoming violent offenders themselves. And the question is, will one or two jurors really latch onto this testimony and spare Stephen Wiggins' life?
Yeah, the verdict has to be unanimous, or Stephen Wiggins gets life instead of death. The words from Scotty Wiggins is that Stephen would every day, all day, be hit in the head by their father. Neama Rahmani, hard to imagine it, but it's a powerful testimony going to the fact that Stephen Wiggins was certainly abused from a very young age by his dad.
Very powerful testimony, Derek. I agree. And I like the defense strategy here. They're telling the story of this trauma that Stephen experienced growing up as a child, this horrific abuse by his father. But they did it without putting their client on the stand, because we know that he would be absolutely destroyed on cross-examination. We've talked about the tattoos. We've talked about his demeanor in court and when he was speaking to law enforcement after the arrest. This is not someone that I think would be sympathetic or a good witness in front of the jury. So they really did a good job of protecting him, shielding him, but still getting his story out for other witnesses.
So Neama Rahmani, I mean, the fact that he can vividly recall a lot of details and yet is stumped by this very important detail, is that suspicious to you?
Very suspicious, but I agree with Gilbert. Bob Durst is masterful, both him and his defense attorney. I wouldn't be surprised if he walks again, even though I think most of us know this is the third murder that he's committed, because he looks frail, he looks sympathetic, he does an excellent job talking to the jurors, and I think they do sympathize with him. And him and his defense team, they've set this up the whole entire time. And this goes back years from when we started this trial before the pandemic. During opening, Dick DeGuerin and the defense team said, you will hear from Bob Durst. So if Durst gets acquitted or the jury hangs, it will be entirely because of this testimony. This is what we've been building up to for years and months of this trial, to the extent that it reopened recently.
Absolutely.
Anyone else, I would say yes, but Bob Durst doesn't play by the same rules, especially when it comes to trials. So this isn't just the first lie he's admitting to. In opening statements, the defense, and we're going to get there, said that Bob Durst lied about that cadaver note that he famously sent Beverly Hills PD. That's one of the key pieces of evidence. He shifted his story, saying that he actually stumbled upon Susan Berman's body, wanted law enforcement to find it, and that's why he sent that letter. after denying it for years, including to Deputy District Attorney John Lewin when he was arrested. This is another lie where he went to, after Kathy disappeared, he went to a neighbor's house. He was caught in the lie. The neighbor testified earlier that they did have dinner with Bob Durst, but it was another day. So he is skillfully, in this very sort of folksy way, trying to navigate through the different lies that he's told over the course of the decades that these three murders have been investigated. There you go. That's that cadaver note. Very
Right.
famous. That's one of the few direct pieces of evidence in this case.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about that as well, and the conflicting statements that Durst made himself over this.
Bob Durst is an amazing storyteller, and this is something that we've seen, just whether it's the Jinx, whether it's the John Lewin interview, whether it's the testimony in the Morris Black trial, and now, I mean, he's telling these vivid stories about the 1970s and 80s, really sort of non-responsive answers that have nothing to do with his attorney's questions, but they're telling a story. And he reminds me of everyone's older relative, someone's grandfather, someone's uncle, who just kind of goes on and on, but you can't help but be just enamored by his stories and how he's talking about Kathy and their
Right.
relationship, and really sort of negating a lot of the bad witnesses that the prosecution has put on the stand over the past several months.
The fact that there's so much question about what happened to Kathleen Durst, Durst potentially being involved, though he's never been charged with that, never been really pinpointed as being involved in the disappearance of his wife's disappearance. The fact is her body's never been found, and the claim is that Susan Berman was killed to stop her from talking about it to investigators. What do you make of Durst's explanation on the stand so far?
Well, it's a tough case for prosecutors for the reasons that you identified. And this is Hollywood, and in every case, I mean, we talked about Stephen Wiggins and how he was not likable, and jury's not going to like him, and that's why he's likely getting the death penalty. And on the other extreme, we have Bob Durst, someone that the jurors do like, and a case that is a very circumstantial case. I mean, of the three murders, Susan Berman's is arguably the most difficult to prove in terms of the evidence. So what John Lewin and the district attorney's office, they want to do is dirty up Bob Durst. Talk about Morris Black, even though he's been acquitted of the most serious charges in that case, and talk about how Bob Durst is involved with the murder of his wife. And some of it is to prove the motive, but a lot of it is to make the jurors not like Bob Durst. And that's why we're hearing all this testimony about food stamps and him shoplifting and all the other sort of strange and weird behavior that he engages in. So the juries don't like him in this particular case.
The fact that she's never been found, her disappearance is still a mystery. That's a big question mark out there, Neama.
It certainly is, and I think the defense theme is that New York botched this. Trials are about stories and themes, and the prosecution's theme is that Bob Durst is an abusive person. I mean, they spent so much time talking about the physical and verbal abuse of Kathy Durst. The defense, on the other hand, wants to paint Kathy as someone who's unstable, someone who didn't show up for classes at medical school, someone that had mental health and psychological and drug issues. So, you're seeing these two very, very different versions of Kathy Durst that are being portrayed by both the prosecution and the defense. And from the defense's position, this was a botched investigation, both in New York and LA. They've really gone after these law enforcement witnesses, saying it was really a sloppy investigation. And, whether it's OJ or whether it's Bob Durst, any good criminal defendant is going to say, hey, the killer is still out there, and law enforcement has the wrong person.
Certainly a quick decision jurors have made here. Just about an hour and 45 minutes of deliberation on the penalty phase here. Hard to say which way they'll go, but it's certainly going to be a big decision once we hear it.
Yes, Derek.
Yeah.
Yes, Derek. Quick decision generally bodes well for the prosecution. I predict a death sentence in this case, given the facts and circumstances, which were heinous, cruel. I can't imagine that this defense team got 12 out of 12 jurors to agree to a life sentence with or without parole. I think this is a clear sign of a death sentence for Stephen Wiggins.
Verdict just handed down after about an hour and 45 minutes of deliberation. The jurors finding that the aggravating factors, the heinousness of the murder warranted him being put to death. So that is the verdict in that case. Deciding beyond a reasonable doubt that Wiggins killed Baker because of his premeditation, the heinous act that was committed, against a member of law enforcement, and that Daniel Baker's body was mutilated after death. Those were the aggravating factors, at least some of them, that the jurors felt outweighed the mitigating circumstances of his prior abuse as a child, his mental health, and mental impairment in the case. Let's bring back in Neama Rahmani and Gilbert Paris. Neama, you called it, both of you did, saying that this would be a death penalty decision here. The jurors made it so.
Right about these cases, but really justice was served. It was a clean sweep for the prosecution, unanimous on all 5 of those aggravating factors. We knew out the gate that the state was pursuing the death penalty, and that's why this case was going to trial. The defense, I tip my hat to them. They really did the best job they could under the circumstances. Really sad case involving a law enforcement officer leaving a young child behind. But ultimately, it was this defendant and his own actions that really caused this juror to return the death verdict, because ultimately he couldn't get out of his own way. And he was convicted, notwithstanding the efforts of his defense.
True justice for the family of Daniel Baker. I mean, we have this death penalty verdict here, but it doesn't bring the loved one back. It
doesn't bring the loved one back. And, you know, Lisa Baker, I'm sure we're going to be hearing from her as well. I hope she can sleep a little bit better tonight. But ultimately, we're going to be looking at multiple rounds of appeals, both through the state and federal courts. So it'll be years, if not longer, before Wiggins is executed. And, you know, I agree with Gilbert. You know, if this were a case where Wiggins just shot Baker and took off, we probably wouldn't be dealing with the death penalty. But the fact that he got out and really executed him when it wasn't necessary to do so, that made it a very different case. In addition to stealing the vehicle and torching the vehicle and the body. What's very interesting, and which we haven't talked about, is Wiggins' girlfriend. She still hasn't been tried, and the state is considering charging her with the death penalty. Now, that might be a little extreme, so that's going to be the next case for us to follow out there in Dickson County.
Right. She was in the car for the commission of this murder for sure. And because this is a death penalty case, an automatic appeal goes. Bringing up Jeanine Pirro and sort of suggesting that she was in a rush to judgment, a rush to prosecute him over the disappearance of his first wife, Kathleen. He seems to suggest that, you know, he was a victim in the midst of this case. What do you make of that?
Theme here, rush to judgment. I'm going to get Bob Durst at all costs, no matter what. And this is something that the defense has been arguing the whole time, and they're getting out good testimony through their star witness. They're saying there's all these other people that could have killed Susan Berman. She had problems with her landlord. She had problems with her manager. She was someone who was very paranoid. So why would Bob Durst kill his best friend? Why would he kill his wife? So this is all very good testimony, because as the defense, you want to point to sloppy investigation, rush to judgment, overzealous prosecutors. And we know that John Lewin, at least, has appeared pretty overzealous and aggressive. So this all plays into that defense theme in this case, and it tees up their argument that Lewin, who's going to cross-examine on Durst for days, I assume, is going after an innocent man and being way too aggressive.
Susan Berman, the victim in this case. Let's bring back in former federal prosecutor Neama Rahmani, as well as criminal defense attorney Gilbert Paris. So clearly the two had a financial relationship, Susan Berman and Robert Durst. We're seeing the check there on the screen. What does that tell you, Neama Rahmani, in terms of, is this hush money, or is it indeed for furniture and other innocuous things?
Derek, it cuts both ways. John Lewin in the district attorney's office are arguing that this was extortion money. Susan Berman was shaking down Bob Durst. She needed the money. She knew where the bodies were buried. And the reason Bob Durst killed her is because he didn't want to pay her, and she threatened to go to law enforcement. And the defense, on the other hand, is arguing that, no, these are friends. Like, why would he kill his best friend? He was helping her financially. They've known each other since the 60s here at UCLA. So, both sides are spending this money in two very different ways. And just notice how they keep talking about Judge Piero. And, I like the judge. I've been on her show, but this is a very liberal jury pool here in Los Angeles, and she might be polarizing and turn off some of the jurors, especially how Durst is saying that she was going after him.
Former federal prosecutor Neama Rahmani, as well as Gilbert Paris, criminal defense attorney. Just some final thoughts here as we wrap up the show and see the last of his testimony, at least for now. Neama Rahmani, what do you make of Robert Durst on the stand?
Derek, I've been doing this 20 years, and I've never seen a case like this. We will never see a case like this. It's fascinating. Murders spanning 20-plus years, 3 of them in 3 different states. A defendant who's testifying over days. Court's dark tomorrow, is going to continue the next week. It's really, truly Hollywood. You couldn't script it any better.
Absolutely. I mean, it brings to mind the O.J. Simpson case, though not as the coverage is not as big or in a different time now, but still a case that has a lot of twists and turns.